On the morning of March 15, 1943, Lieutenant General Brehon Somervell walked through the corridors of a building that had not existed 18 months earlier, reviewing production charts that described a war unlike any other nation had ever fought. The Pentagon smelled of fresh concrete, floor wax, and the particular chemical sharpness of mimeograph ink that permeated every office where papers multiplied faster than filing systems could contain them. Somervell was 51 years old, a West Point engineer who had built LaGuardia Airport and administered Works Progress Administration projects across the Northeast before the war transformed him into the commander of the largest logistics operation in human history. His face was lean, his manner brisk, his patience for inefficiency non-existent. The charts he carried showed numbers that would have seemed fantastical to any military planner of the previous generation. American factories were now producing more war material than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. The building itself embodied the approach Somervell brought to everything he touched. The Pentagon had been his project, conceived in 1941 when the War Department's scattered offices across Washington made coordination nearly impossible. He had driven the construction with a ruthlessness that horrified peacetime bureaucrats, 16 months from groundbreaking to occupancy. The largest office building in the world, completed faster than most nations could have designed it. The structure housed 40,000 workers in 17 miles of corridors, processing the paperwork that translated American industrial capacity into military power. Critics had called it a monument to waste. Somervell considered it a monument to what America could accomplish when it stopped pretending that constraints were real. The Army Service Forces he commanded was not a combat organization. It built nothing that killed enemy soldiers directly. What it did was moving supplies from factories to ports, from ports to ships, from ships to beaches, from beaches to depots, from depots to the men who would use them to fight. The scale of this movement dwarfed anything military logistics had previously attempted. Somervell's organization fed, clothed, equipped, and transported an army that would grow to over 8 million soldiers deployed across 2 oceans and 5 continents. It constructed bases in locations that had been wilderness months earlier. It operated ports that handled more tonnage than the world's busiest commercial harbors. It ran a transportation network that would have ranked among the largest corporations on Earth if measured by peacetime standards. The production charts Somervell reviewed that March morning documented an industrial mobilization that had no parallel in history. American factories had produced 48,000 aircraft in 1942, a number that exceeded total German and Japanese production combined. They would produce 86,000 in 1943. Tank production had reached 30,000 units annually, enough to replace losses and build new armored divisions simultaneously. Artillery, ammunition, vehicles, radios, medical supplies, rations, every category showed curves climbing toward totals that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. The arsenal of democracy had become an arsenal without precedent, and Somervell's job was to ensure that what the factories produced reached the soldiers who needed it. What distinguished this production from the war efforts of other nations was not merely scale, but invulnerability. No German bomber could reach Detroit. No Japanese submarine could interdict the rail lines connecting Pittsburgh steel mills to East Coast ports. No enemy army would ever threaten the workers who assembled aircraft in California or tanks in Michigan. The United States fought World War II from a position of geographic security that no other major belligerent enjoyed. Britain endured the Blitz. The Soviet Union lost its western industrial regions to German occupation. Germany and Japan would be progressively demolished by strategic bombing. Only America produced without fear of disruption, manufactured without threat of destruction, planned without the possibility that enemy action might invalidate every calculation. Somervell understood this advantage with the clarity of an engineer assessing structural loads. The war would be won not by superior tactics or braver soldiers, though American tactics would prove adequate and American soldiers would fight with determination. The war would be won by the simple mathematics of production: more ships than submarines could sink, more aircraft than fighters could shoot down, more supplies than combat could consume. Every ton of material that reached the front represented industrial capacity that the enemy could not match. Every logistics problem solved was a battle won before it was fought. The American way of war was taking shape in the corridors of the Pentagon, and it looked nothing like the wars that other nations were fighting. The geographic foundation of American military power was so fundamental that those who benefited from it rarely paused to consider its implications. Somervell's logistics empire operated on assumptions that no other nation's military planners could share: that factories would continue producing, that rail lines would remain intact, that ports would function without interruption, that the continental United States would remain inviolate throughout the conflict. These assumptions were not hopes or projections. They were certainties guaranteed by 3,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean and 6,000 miles of Pacific, barriers that no enemy possessed the capability to cross in force. The war that Somervell managed was a war fought entirely on other people's territory, supplied from a homeland that would never hear an enemy bomb fall. The contrast with every other major belligerent illuminated what American geography made possible. Britain, the island nation that had relied on naval supremacy for centuries, discovered in 1940 that air power had transformed the English Channel into a 20-mile inconvenience. German bombers struck London, Coventry, Birmingham, and Liverpool, destroying factories, disrupting production, killing workers whose skills could not be quickly replaced. The Blitz did not break British morale, but it imposed costs that American planners never had to calculate. Dispersed production, underground facilities, interrupted supply chains, the constant drain of resources devoted to civil defense rather than offensive capability. British war production achieved remarkable levels despite these constraints, but the constraints were real, and they consumed capacity that might otherwise have produced weapons. The Soviet Union paid a price for geography that dwarfed anything the Western Allies experienced. German forces in 1941 and 1942 overran the most industrialized regions of the country, capturing or destroying factories that had produced the majority of Soviet steel, coal, and manufactured goods. The evacuation of industrial equipment eastward, entire factories loaded onto rail cars and reassembled beyond the Urals, represented one of history's most remarkable logistical achievements. But it came at a cost, measured in months of lost production, in machinery damaged during transit, in workers who died during relocations conducted in desperate haste. Soviet production recovered and eventually exceeded pre-war levels, but recovery required sacrifices that American industry never contemplated. Workers laboring in unheated facilities through Siberian winters, rations that kept bodies functional but not healthy, working conditions that would have provoked strikes in any American factory. Germany and Japan operated under constraints that tightened with each passing month. Allied strategic bombing progressively degraded German industrial capacity, forcing dispersal of production into smaller facilities that sacrificed efficiency for survivability. Japanese industry, dependent on imported raw materials, watched its supply lines severed by American submarines and aircraft until factories stood idle for lack of steel, aluminum, and fuel. Both nations mobilized their economies with impressive thoroughness, extracting production from populations subjected to demands that democratic societies would not have tolerated. But mobilization could not compensate for vulnerability. factories that could be bombed, supply lines that could be cut, workers who could be killed. These realities shaped Axis war production in ways that American planners observed but did not experience. Somervell's calculations proceeded from a fundamentally different starting point. When he projected aircraft production for 1944, he did not discount for bombing damage because there would be no bombing damage. When he scheduled shipments from West Coast ports, he did not factor in losses to enemy interdiction because no enemy could interdict American coastal waters. When he allocated rail capacity for military freight, he did not reserve margins for disruption because American railroads would operate throughout the war exactly as they operated in peacetime, subject only to the ordinary constraints of equipment and labor. The logistics empire he commanded enjoyed a security that transformed planning from an exercise in risk management into an exercise in pure optimization. The question was never whether supplies would arrive, only how to maximize the efficiency of their delivery. This invulnerability shaped American strategic thinking in ways that would persist long after the war's end. A nation that had never experienced the destruction of its industrial base came to believe that industrial bases need not be destroyed, that wars could be won through production rather than devastation, that overwhelming material superiority would always prevail over tactical necessity. Somervell embodied this belief. His war was a war of shipping schedules and production quotas, of tonnage calculations and inventory management. The violence occurred elsewhere, conducted by men he would never meet, in places he would never visit. His contribution was ensuring that those men possessed everything they needed to prevail. The American way of war was taking form, and its distinguishing characteristic was the conviction that logistics was strategy. Henry John Kaiser had never built a ship when he secured his first contract with the United States Maritime Commission in 1940. He was 58 years old, a road contractor from Washington State whose previous projects included the Hoover Dam, the Grand Coulee Dam, and thousands of miles of highways across the American West. His hands were thick from decades of outdoor work, his manner direct to the point of abrasiveness, his patience for experts who explained why things could not be done approximately zero. The shipbuilding establishment regarded him with a mixture of contempt and alarm. A man who knew nothing about naval architecture, nothing about marine engineering, nothing about the traditions that had governed shipyard operations since the age of sail. Kaiser regarded the shipbuilding establishment with similar disdain. They built ships the way their grandfathers had built ships. He intended to build them the way he had built dams. The Richmond shipyard he established on the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay smelled of welding flux, fresh paint, and the salt wind that blew across the water from the Pacific. The facility had been tidal marshland 18 months earlier. Now it sprawled across hundreds of acres, its ways and cranes and assembly buildings arranged according to principles that traditional shipbuilders found incomprehensible. Kaiser had not designed the yard to build ships. He had designed it to assemble ships from components manufactured elsewhere, a distinction that represented a fundamental reimagining of what shipbuilding meant. The keels laid at Richmond would receive prefabricated sections produced in factories scattered across Northern California, sections that arrived by rail and truck ready for installation, their welding already complete, their fittings already attached. The Liberty ship that Kaiser's yards would produce in unprecedented numbers was not an elegant vessel. It was a design selected for simplicity rather than performance, a cargo carrier whose specifications prioritized ease of construction over speed, efficiency, or longevity. Traditional shipbuilders considered the Liberty ship an embarrassment, a crude, slow, mechanically unsophisticated vessel unworthy of comparison to the products of established yards. Kaiser considered it perfect. The ship's simplicity was precisely what made mass production possible. Every Liberty ship was identical to every other Liberty ship, its components interchangeable, its assembly reducible to a sequence of standardized operations that workers could learn in weeks rather than years. The craft tradition that shipbuilding had preserved for centuries was irrelevant to Kaiser's purposes. He was not producing craft, he was producing volume. The workers who flooded into Richmond came from backgrounds that would have disqualified them for employment in traditional shipyards. They were farmers from Oklahoma, migrants from the Deep South, women who had never held industrial jobs, men whose previous experience involved retail or agriculture or office work. Traditional shipbuilding required apprenticeships that lasted years, skills transmitted from master craftsmen to students through processes that could not be accelerated. Kaiser's methods required training measured in days. A worker did not need to understand shipbuilding. A worker needed to understand one task, installing one type of fitting, welding one type of joint, operating one type of equipment, and to perform that task repeatedly with acceptable quality. The knowledge that traditional craftsmen carried in their heads was embedded instead in the production system itself, in jigs and templates and procedures that guided unskilled hands toward acceptable results. The irony that Kaiser embodied would shape American industrial mythology for generations. His ignorance of shipbuilding was precisely what enabled him to revolutionize it. A man who understood how ships had always been built would have understood why they had to be built that way. A man who knew nothing saw only problems to be solved through methods that had worked in other industries. Resistance from shipbuilding experts confirmed Kaiser's suspicion that expertise was often another word for inability to adapt. The men who knew most about ships knew least about mass production. The man who knew most about mass production would build more ships than all of them combined. Somervell watched Kaiser's progress from Washington with the appreciation of one logistics revolutionary for another. The ships that Richmond produced would carry the supplies that Somervell's organization assembled. The two men had never met, operated in different spheres, answered to different authorities. But they were solving the same problem through the same fundamental insight, that American advantage lay not in doing things better than the enemy, but in doing them bigger, faster, and in quantities that rendered qualitative differences irrelevant. The war would be won by men who thought in terms of systems rather than units, production rather than performance, throughput rather than craftsmanship. Kaiser's shipyards and Somervell's logistics networks were components of the same machine, a machine that no other nation possessed the resources or the security to construct. The American approach to manpower reflected the same philosophy that governed American production: substitute capital for labor, machines for men, abundance for sacrifice. Somervell's planning documents articulated this principle with mathematical precision. Every ton of supplies delivered to a combat zone reduced casualties by a calculable amount. Every vehicle that carried soldiers reduced the exhaustion that degraded combat effectiveness. Every artillery shell that suppressed an enemy position reduced the infantry exposure required to take it. The American soldier would fight with more firepower support, more logistical backing, more mechanical assistance than any soldier in history. Not because American commanders were more humane than their counterparts, but because American resources made such support possible and American political culture made casualties intolerable. The decision to field 90 divisions rather than the 300 that early mobilization plans had contemplated reflected this calculus. Germany maintained approximately 300 divisions at peak strength. The Soviet Union fielded over 500. American planners concluded that 90 divisions, properly equipped and supported, could accomplish objectives that larger but less lavishly supplied forces could not. Each American division would possess more vehicles, more radios, more artillery, more ammunition than its counterparts in any other army. The logistical tail required to support such divisions would be enormous, roughly 3 support personnel for every combat soldier. But the logistics infrastructure existed to sustain that tail, and the industrial base existed to equip it. Other nations economized on support to maximize combat strength. America economized on combat strength to maximize support. Somervell's calculations extended to every aspect of military life. An American soldier consumed approximately 50 pounds of supplies per day when all requirements were aggregated: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, replacement equipment, mail, and the 1,000 minor items that sustained both physical capability and psychological morale. A German soldier made do with less than half that. A Japanese soldier survived on a fraction. The differential represented not merely American wealth, but American philosophy, that soldiers who were well-fed, well-equipped, and well-supported would fight more effectively than soldiers who were hungry, undersupplied, and exhausted. The investment in logistics was an investment in combat power, measured not in divisions fielded, but in capability delivered. The mechanization of the American Army expressed this philosophy in steel and gasoline. An American infantry division possessed more than 2,000 vehicles of all types: trucks, jeeps, artillery prime movers, ambulances, maintenance vehicles, giving it a mobility that foot-bound formations could not match. An American armored division was entirely motorized, capable of sustained advances that horse-drawn logistics could never support. The fuel requirements for such mechanization were staggering. The American Army in Europe consumed more petroleum products than the entire German military, a differential that reflected both American abundance and German scarcity. But the consumption purchased capability. American units moved faster, concentrated quickly, sustained operations longer than opponents who could not match their logistical depth. The strategic bombing campaign embodied the American preference for machines over men in its purest form. Rather than accepting the casualties that ground combat inevitably produced, American planners sought to destroy German war-making capacity from the air, to win the war through industrial demolition rather than territorial conquest. The campaign required enormous investment in aircraft, crews, and supporting infrastructure, and it produced casualties among airmen that exceeded infantry losses in some periods. But the theory held that strategic bombing would shorten the war, reduce total casualties, and achieve victory through the application of technology rather than the expenditure of lives. Whether the theory proved correct remained debated long after the war's end, but the impulse it reflected was characteristically American. The belief that problems had technical solutions, that machines could accomplish what men could not, that investment in production was preferable to investment in blood. Somervell understood that this approach required industrial capacity that no other nation possessed. A poor country could not fight a rich man's war. A nation without secure factories could not sustain production at the levels American strategy required. A society unwilling to defer consumption could not redirect resources to military production on the necessary scale. Every assumption underlying American strategy depended on conditions that existed only in the United States: geographic security, industrial depth, resource abundance, and a political system capable of mobilizing wealth without mobilizing poverty. The American way of war was not exportable. It was the product of circumstances that history provided to one nation and denied to all others. Somervell's logistics empire did not prove that overwhelming production could win wars. It proved that overwhelming production could win wars for a nation that possessed overwhelming production. The distinction mattered more than most Americans recognized. The revolution Kaiser unleashed at Richmond produced results that horrified traditional shipbuilders and delighted the military planners who needed vessels faster than German submarines could sink them. In September 1942, his yard launched the SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to delivery,
a publicity stunt that demonstrated what was possible when shipbuilding abandoned every assumption that had governed the industry for centuries. The previous record for Liberty ship construction had been measured in months. Kaiser's workers had compressed the process into less than a week, assembling a 10,000-ton vessel from prefabricated sections with a speed that made the achievement seem less like manufacturing than conjuring. The methods that produced such results would have been impossible in any traditional shipyard. Kaiser's facilities welded hulls together rather than riveting them, a technique that shipbuilding conservatives considered dangerous, unreliable, and likely to produce vessels that would crack and sink in heavy seas. The conservatives were not entirely wrong. Early welded ships did experience cracking problems, particularly in cold North Atlantic waters, where brittle fracture propagated through hulls stressed by wave action and thermal contraction. But the problems were engineering challenges rather than fundamental flaws, and Kaiser's organization addressed them through design modifications and improved welding procedures while production continued uninterrupted. Traditional shipbuilders would have halted construction until the problems were solved. Kaiser solved the problems while building ships, accepting imperfection as the price of speed. The workforce that assembled these vessels represented a social transformation as significant as the industrial one. By 1943, Kaiser's Richmond yards employed over 90,000 workers, a population larger than most American cities, drawn from every region of the country and every demographic category that peacetime shipbuilding had excluded. Women constituted nearly 30% of the workforce, performing tasks that pre-war industry had considered impossible for female workers: welding, riveting, crane operation, jobs that required strength and skill and tolerance for dangerous conditions. The shipyards were not utopias of racial harmony. Discrimination persisted in hiring, housing, and promotion, but they represented departures from established practice that would have consequences extending far beyond the war. Kaiser provided his workers with amenities that other war industries considered extravagant. Child care centers allowed mothers to work full shifts without sacrificing their children's welfare. On-site medical facilities treated injuries and illnesses that otherwise would have cost production time. Cafeterias served meals around the clock to accommodate the continuous shifts that kept the yards operating 24 hours daily. Kaiser had learned from his dam-building experience that worker welfare translated directly into worker productivity, that investments in housing and healthcare and convenience paid returns measured in reduced turnover and increased output. The shipbuilding establishment viewed such expenditures as wasteful indulgence. Kaiser viewed them as engineering problems with engineering solutions. The ships that emerged from this system were not beautiful. They were not fast, 11 knots maximum, barely enough to maintain convoy formation. They were not durable, designed for a 5-year lifespan that many would not survive. They were not economical to operate, consuming fuel at rates that peacetime shipping would never have tolerated. But they were available in numbers that transformed the strategic equation. Kaiser's yards alone delivered over 1,400 vessels during the war, approximately 1/3 of all Liberty ships produced. The combined output of American shipyards exceeded losses to submarine attack by margins that grew wider with each passing month, turning the Battle of the Atlantic from a contest the Allies might lose into a mathematical certainty they would win.
Somervell tracked the shipping numbers with the attention of a man whose entire logistics architecture depended on ocean transport. Every Liberty ship that reached service represented approximately 10,000 tons of cargo capacity, enough to deliver supplies for an infantry division for a month, enough to transport the equipment for an armored battalion, enough to carry the ammunition for a major offensive. The ships were fungible, interchangeable, disposable if necessary, assets measured in aggregate capacity rather than individual value. If submarines sank one, another would take its place. If storms destroyed 10, the production system would replace them within weeks. The American approach to shipbuilding mirrored the American approach to warfare itself. Quantity as quality,
Production as strategy, the overwhelming application of industrial capacity to problems that other nations addressed through skill, sacrifice, and ingenuity born of scarcity. Kaiser never visited the combat zones where his ships delivered their cargoes. His war was fought in boardrooms and production meetings, in negotiations with suppliers, and disputes with labor unions, in the endless problem-solving that kept the yards operating at capacities that peacetime industry would have considered impossible. He was building the bridge across which American power would flow to distant battlefields, and the bridge was made of welded steel plate and the labor of workers who had never seen the ocean before the war brought them to its edge. The political structure that enabled American abundance operated through mechanisms that no other belligerent possessed or could have replicated. Somervell's logistics empire depended on a civilian economy that had to be persuaded rather than commanded, on workers who could refuse employment and consumers who could resist rationing, on a democratic system that translated popular discontent into political pressure with an efficiency that autocracies never faced. The constraints were real. They limited what the war economy could extract from the civilian population. They also created a sustainability that coerced economies could not match, a mobilization built on consent rather than compulsion, capable of enduring for years without the social fractures that total war produced elsewhere. The war bond campaigns that funded American military expenditure illustrated this democratic mobilization. The federal government could have financed the war entirely through taxation and currency creation, as other nations did, but chose instead to invite civilian participation through bond purchases that gave ordinary Americans a financial stake in victory. The campaigns were masterpieces of persuasion, celebrity endorsements, workplace competitions, emotional appeals linking bond purchases to the safety of sons and husbands serving overseas. They raised over $185 billion during the war, roughly half of total military expenditure, while simultaneously absorbing consumer purchasing power that might otherwise have driven inflation. The bonds were not economically necessary, they were politically essential, transforming the war from a government project into a collective enterprise in which every purchaser became an investor. Rationing operated through similar mechanisms of persuasion rather than pure coercion. Gasoline, rubber, sugar, meat, coffee, shoes. The list of controlled commodities grew as the war continued, each restriction requiring explanation and justification to a population that retained the ability to punish politicians who imposed unpopular measures. The Office of Price Administration employed over 60,000 paid workers and hundreds of thousands of volunteers to administer a system that touched every household in America, a bureaucratic apparatus that would have been unnecessary in a nation willing to simply seize what it needed. Black markets existed, compliance was imperfect, and resentment simmered among citizens who suspected that sacrifices were unequally distributed. But the system held, maintained by a combination of patriotic commitment and social pressure that democratic participation had cultivated. Somervell navigated these political realities with the pragmatism of a man who had learned to build public works through the patronage systems of the Depression-era America. His dealings with Congress required constant attention to the concerns of representatives whose constituents included both war workers demanding higher wages and taxpayers demanding fiscal restraint. His relationships with labor unions involved negotiations that balanced production imperatives against worker grievances that could not simply be suppressed. His coordination with civilian industry required persuading corporations to accept contracts that disrupted peacetime operations and profits that government renegotiators might later reduce. Every element of the logistics system he commanded existed within a political context that shaped what was possible and what was not. The labor situation demonstrated both the constraints and advantages of democratic mobilization. American workers could strike, and did. Work stoppages continued throughout the war,
despite no strike pledges from union leadership, as local grievances overwhelmed national commitments. The government possessed emergency powers to seize struck facilities, but used them sparingly, preferring negotiated settlements that preserved the voluntary cooperation on which sustained production depended. Wages rose, working conditions improved, and union membership expanded, developments that business leaders considered dangerous concessions to labor radicalism. But the concessions purchased something that coercion could not: a workforce that showed up voluntarily, that maintained productivity through intrinsic motivation rather than fear, that would continue producing after the emergency powers expired and the war economy demobilized. The contrast with Axis mobilization illuminated what American political culture made possible. German war production relied increasingly on forced labor, foreign workers conscripted from occupied territories, concentration camp prisoners worked to death in underground factories, a system of coercion that extracted output at costs measured in human degradation. Japanese mobilization demanded sacrifices from a population conditioned to obedience, sacrifices that intensified as the war turned against the empire, until civilians were expected to die rather than surrender. Soviet mobilization combined ideological commitment with state terror, achieving production miracles through methods that no democratic society could have employed. Each system produced results. None produced results sustainably. The American system, constrained by democratic accountability, generated output that increased year after year without the social deterioration that coerced economies experienced. Somervell understood that the political constraints he navigated were also political assets. A war economy built on consent could be maintained indefinitely. A workforce that labored voluntarily would sustain effort that conscripts could not. An industrial system that preserved civilian prosperity would not face the collapse that awaited economies stripped bare for military production. The American way of war was expensive in material terms, but economical in political terms, purchasing victory at costs the society could absorb without permanent damage. The boys would come home to jobs and houses and opportunities, to a nation that had grown richer rather than poorer during the conflict. No other belligerent could make that promise. No other belligerent possessed the resources to keep it. The cost of the American way of war revealed itself in places where overwhelming logistics could not substitute for infantry in contact with the enemy. Somervell's production charts showed curves climbing toward victory, but the casualty reports that crossed his desk told a different story. A story of young men dying in hedgerows and forests and island jungles, where firepower superiority and material abundance reached their limits. The Normandy hedgerows provided the first sustained demonstration of these limits. American forces that landed in June 1944 with overwhelming air support, naval gunfire, and artillery backing found themselves fighting through terrain that negated every material advantage they possessed. The bocage, dense hedgerows separating small fields, created a defensive landscape where German soldiers with machine guns and mortars could hold positions against opponents who outnumbered and outgunned them. Tanks could not maneuver through the earthen embankments. Artillery could not observe targets hidden beneath the foliage. Air support could not identify positions concealed in terrain that looked identical from above. The war that Somervell's logistics had prepared American forces to fight was not the war they encountered in the weeks following D-Day. The casualties accumulated with a steadiness that alarmed commanders who had expected material superiority to produce rapid advance. Infantry divisions that had landed at full strength reported losses that exceeded replacement rates within weeks. Rifle companies that should have numbered 200 men fought with 60, then 40, then fewer still. The men who fell were not statistics in Somervell's production charts. They were the men for whom all the production existed,
the end point of a logistics chain that stretched from American factories across the Atlantic to Norman beaches to hedgerow fighting positions where 20-year-olds from Ohio and Texas died, taking objectives that maps marked with symbols too small to convey what taking them cost. Somervell received the casualty reports alongside the production reports, the two streams of information describing the same war from perspectives that could not be reconciled. His organization delivered supplies in quantities that exceeded every projection. The supplies reached the combat zone through transportation networks that functioned with remarkable efficiency. The men who received those supplies possessed more ammunition, more food, more medical support, more of anything than any army in history. And they died anyway, because the enemy also possessed ammunition and determination and terrain that favored defense, and no amount of logistical superiority could change the fundamental calculus of infantry combat, that ground is taken by men who advance into fire, and some of those men do not survive the advance.
The Pacific Theater presented different terrain and identical limits. Island assaults against fortified Japanese positions produced casualty rates that shocked commanders accustomed to calculating victory in terms of material ratios. Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima. Each name represented a battle where American advantages in firepower, supply, and air superiority proved insufficient to prevent losses measured in thousands of dead and wounded Marines. The Japanese defenders possessed few of the material resources that American planners considered essential for military effectiveness. They possessed willingness to die, and that willingness extracted costs that no production schedule could offset. The bombardments that preceded landings destroyed positions and killed defenders, but enough defenders survived in enough positions to turn beaches into killing grounds, where the American way of war met its most fundamental constraint. The infantry replacement crisis of late 1944 expressed these limits in administrative terms. The Army had planned for casualty rates based on assumptions that combat experience systematically exceeded. Rifle platoons bore losses disproportionate to their numbers, consuming replacements faster than training systems could produce them. Somervell's organization could deliver weapons, ammunition, equipment in unlimited quantities. It could not deliver trained infantrymen at rates sufficient to maintain combat strength in divisions that had been fighting continuously for months. The American approach had invested in machines rather than men, in firepower rather than manpower, and the investment had produced an army whose logistics were inexhaustible, but whose infantry was not. Kaiser's ships delivered the supplies that Somervell's organization assembled, and the supplies reached men who used them to fight and die in numbers that no production miracle could prevent. The American way of war worked. It won battles, captured territory, destroyed enemy forces, and achieved objectives that other approaches might have failed to achieve. It did not eliminate the fundamental reality that war kills people, that victory requires sacrifice, that all the industrial capacity in the world cannot substitute for young men willing to advance into machine gun fire. The production charts showed success. The cemetery registries showed its price. The war ended, and the men who had built the systems that won it returned to questions about what those systems meant. Somervell remained in uniform until 1946, overseeing the demobilization of the logistics empire he had constructed, the reversal of everything he had spent 4 years building, the conversion of military capacity back to civilian purpose. The Pentagon he had built continued to house the War Department and its successor organizations, a permanent monument to the scale of American military administration. The supply networks he had created dissolved as contracts expired and workers returned to peacetime employment. The production curves that had climbed so relentlessly now descended, factories converting from tanks to automobiles, from artillery shells to consumer goods, from the instruments of destruction to the products of prosperity.
His health deteriorated rapidly after leaving the army. The years of 18-hour days, of constant travel, of pressure that never relented extracted costs that peacetime could not repair. Somervell accepted a position with the Coppers Company, an industrial firm whose operations bore no relationship to the military logistics he had mastered, and he approached business with the same intensity he had brought to war. But the intensity could not be sustained. Heart disease, the consequence of stress and exhaustion accumulated over decades, progressively limited his capacity for the work that had defined his life. He died on February 13, 1955, in Ocala, Florida, at age 62. The obituaries noted his construction of the Pentagon, his command of Army service forces, his role in the mobilization that had made Allied victory possible. They did not capture what he had understood better than almost anyone, that American military power rested on foundations that geography and industry had provided, that the war had been won by factories as much as by soldiers, that the logistics he had managed were not support for combat, but the essence of the American way of war. Kaiser survived longer and transformed more completely. The shipbuilder who had never built a ship before 1940 emerged from the war as one of America's most celebrated industrialists, his methods studied and imitated across industries that had nothing to do with maritime construction. He did not return to shipbuilding when peace came. The Liberty ships that had carried American power across the oceans were sold, scrapped, or converted to peacetime purposes, their mission completed, their construction techniques absorbed into industrial practice. Kaiser turned instead to automobiles, to aluminum, to cement and steel, and the heavy industries that post-war America would need to sustain its growth. He built housing developments for the workers who had flooded into his shipyards. He constructed the infrastructure of suburban expansion that would reshape American geography in the decades ahead.
The most unexpected transformation came in healthcare. Kaiser had provided medical services to his shipyard workers during the war, discovering that prepaid group practice, what would later be called managed care, reduced costs while improving outcomes. The insight became an obsession. He established Kaiser Permanente as a civilian organization in 1945, extending to the general public the healthcare model he had developed for war workers. The venture faced opposition from medical associations that considered prepaid group practice a threat to physician autonomy, from hospitals that resisted integration into managed systems, from insurers whose business models depended on arrangements that Kaiser's approach disrupted. He persisted with the same stubbornness that had carried him through conflicts with traditional shipbuilders, building an organization that would eventually serve millions of Americans. The man who had built ships to win a war spent his final decades building healthcare to serve a peace. Kaiser died on August 24, 1967, in Honolulu at the age of 85. His legacy extended far beyond the vessels that had carried his name across the world's oceans. The production methods he had pioneered, prefabrication, standardization, the substitution of system for craft, had transformed American industry in ways that persisted long after the specific products changed. The healthcare organization he had founded continued expanding, its model influencing how Americans received and paid for medical services into the 21st century. The shipyards themselves were mostly gone, converted to other purposes, or abandoned entirely, their wartime function a memory preserved in photographs and production records rather than living enterprise. The American way of war that Somervell and Kaiser had helped to create persisted as doctrine and assumption long after both men were dead. The belief that overwhelming production could substitute for tactical finesse, that logistics was strategy, that problems were fundamentally industrial rather than military. These convictions shaped American approaches to conflicts that bore no resemblance to the war that had generated them. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, Iraq,
Each war tested the proposition that material superiority guaranteed victory, and each produced results that complicated the simple faith that production solved what combat could not. The men who planned those wars had inherited assumptions from 1941 to 1945 without inheriting the conditions that had made those assumptions valid. Geographic invulnerability, industrial supremacy, enemies whose defeat was primarily logistical. These circumstances had produced victory once and might never recur in quite the same configuration. What Somervell had understood and Kaiser had demonstrated was not that America would always win its wars through production. It was that America in 1941 to 1945 had possessed advantages so overwhelming that production could accomplish what military genius could not. That a nation secure in its homeland, unlimited in its resources, and willing to invest wealth rather than blood, could achieve victories unavailable to nations that lacked these gifts. The lesson was not universal. It was specific to a moment when geography and industry and political culture aligned to create possibilities that existed nowhere else on Earth. The American way of war was not a template for all conflicts. It was the product of circumstances that history had provided once and might never provide again.